What are design principles and tools for innovation? How can design principles and practices help government executives transform how government does business and meet its missions? And what strategies can leaders employ to achieve a design mindset? I'll explore these questions and so much more with Sarah Stein Greenberg, author of Creative Acts for Curious People: How to Think, Create, and Lead in Unconventional Ways. Perhaps you could highlight some of the core principles and tools and techniques taught at the D School.
So we are really interested in figuring out how do we help people unlock their creativity, particularly as applied to the kinds of relevant challenges that we all face today. So, and I'll just give you an example. Like we are all, living through a time when each one of us is waking up every day and solving problems or addressing challenges that none of us were really trained for, and that are quite challenging. And that's true whether we're thinking about just like in a family context, the huge numbers of parents who had to assume new roles in the past 18 months, being a coach or a teacher at home. Thinking about as some of us are starting to go back to an office environment, what the new kinds of etiquette and norms are going to look like, the kinds of more regional or nationwide challenges around climate change, around all kinds of social change that's happening. All of those challenges come with a fair amount of ambiguity and uncertainty. And that is really a perfect context for the kinds of skills that you learn in design to show up. And those skills have to do with being able to kind of arrive at a new challenge and have a routine way and a set of tools to confront that challenge. So often one of the first things that we do is we ask students to create maps, to do a whole bunch of contextual research, to understand the systems and the history and the background, the context that has shaped the particular problem that they're interested in, but not just to do secondary research, also to go and really observe the environment, to talk to individuals, to conduct depth interviews, and to try to understand both at the systems level and the individual human level what some of those different experiences are. And I'll give you a great example of this. We had a group of former students who, after they graduated, they went on to start working in the state of Michigan around the challenge of redesigning public benefits. And public benefits in Michigan at the time had an extremely long and cumbersome application process, and it had many, many different stakeholders. And our alums, Lena and Adam Selzer and Michael Brennan, they started with that human level. They started doing interviews. They started understanding the system. They interviewed both people who were applying for benefits, but also lots of people who worked within the system and were trying to provide the services. They were the caseworkers. They were the administrators. And through that process, they recognized that there were a number of opportunities for significant improvement. And then through experimentation, what we call prototyping, coming up with new ideas and rapidly testing them before you actually move into implementation, that process allowed them to design a much shorter process that costs less and that actually engages people in a much more human way. And that project has been such a success that they're continuing to work with the state of Michigan on helping to redesign other aspects of the public benefits system.
So, Sarah, you mentioned the public benefits efforts in Michigan. Is there a specific industry or sector that has truly inculcated the use and application of what is taught at the D School, or are its approaches used and applied by many sectors?
Yeah, there's definitely, a strong association between design and the private sector in general. That really came about in kind of the post-World War II era. But in this, the past several decades, the design really is being drawn into all different kinds of sectors. So there are many people within the K-12 education system who are really interested both in how design can help redesign schools and education, but also how younger students may benefit from learning some of these same tactics and skills early on. People in the public sector are using it increasingly, as in the example that I just gave in Detroit and in Michigan. In healthcare, there is a real interest in using design to become what we call more human-centered, right? And to look at healthcare problems and healthcare systems through the lens, not just of patient outcomes, but of the patient experience, even of the family experience and the clinician's experience. So there are so many different places where design is being seen as a tool to really innovate and come up with new and better approaches to complex challenges.
So, I love the title of your book, Creative Acts for Curious People, How to Think, Create, and Lead in Unconventional Ways. Sarah, what's the goal of your book and what prompted you to write it?
Well, I think it really goes back to this idea about these challenging times that we're all in. My colleague, Lisa K. Solomon, who's a futurist, she just made this wonderful observation one day, which is, none of us took a class in college about how to navigate ambiguity, but that is the fundamentals of what we teach at the D School, right? It's like, so now we've arrived in this moment and a lot of us feel pretty unprepared. But actually, when you have a routine way to approach a new challenge as a learner, and with ways to unlock your own creative abilities, you are far more likely to be able to meet those ambiguous challenges of the moment. And I have a very strong level of conviction that design is an important part of solving some of those big challenges that we face today. And of course, the reality is that, most people won't, get a chance to come see us in California. And so I really wanted to take what I think of as some of the best and strongest ideas, and not just the ideas and the skills, but really even the way that we teach them at the D School, and share that with as broad an audience as possible. And that was really my goal in writing the book.
Yeah, I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the exercises and some of the practical advice you give folks in the book, and in particular, new ways of seeing. You introduce terms like shadowing, prototyping, insight, sketching, reflections throughout the book. But I was wondering if you could, for our audience, highlight some tools for seeing things in new ways, and how these tools and techniques train our attention and possibly make the hidden visible and move beyond, what's right in front of us, the obvious.
Well, this is one of my favorite cluster of assignments that I provide in the book. And you're absolutely right. I put a lot of the actual assignments that we teach at the D School in here, because I actually want to get people trying new things, not only reading about them. So some of the assignments that really fall into this category involve allowing yourself the time and space to try to observe things in a new way with some specific prompts and some specific rules. So one, for example, that my colleague Carissa Carter teaches a lot is called the derive. And the derive is a way of taking, it means to drift in French. And it's the idea that if you train your attention in a very specific way, you will see new things that you maybe have been walking by for years that you didn't notice were there. So in the derive, you pick one attribute to follow, and perhaps you do this in your neighborhood or in a large building. And you, for example, maybe you pick the color yellow, and you see something yellow and you go investigate it. And then you see the next thing that's yellow, and you drift over in that direction. And then the next thing. And just the act of isolating that one quality, your brain is starting to filter the information that's around you in a really different way. And all of a sudden you see new things and you think about new things. And I can't quite explain why it is so powerful. But as Carissa says, when people come back from doing a derive, it is the perfect way to kind of reset how your brain is thinking and observing the world. And another experience that you mentioned which is called shadowing, is one that we use a lot actually in education, in K-12 education. And this involves the practice of choosing someone in your organization. It could be a customer, it could be a student, it could be somebody who's a brand new hire who you want to really learn about their experience, but somebody who is having a different experience of navigating the ecosystem than you are. And you simply follow them and shadow them with their permission, of course, for a full day. So with our educators, they're going to meet the kid that they're shadowing at the bus stop in the morning. They're going to follow them all day. They're going to recess. They're going to math. They're going to lunch. And educators come back and have some, wildly profound observations as a result of this. And part of it, again, is it's stimulating that, degree of empathy to see things through someone else's eyes for a day. And it often gives rise to really important observations about where things aren't working or where things could be improved and where there's opportunity for innovation. So those are two examples of really powerful exercises. One takes an hour, one takes a day, that can completely kind of reframe and tune up your brain in terms of how you're observing and how you're noticing.
How does things like journey mapping and methods around design, how are they powerful tools for helping one to learn?
Yeah, I personally use journey mapping not just to help organize data and think about what the customer journey might be, but also as a tool for reflection on learning. And what I've done many times is that at the end of a class, I'll ask my students to reflect back on the 10 or 12 weeks that we've spent together, and actually to make a personal map of that time and their experience during that time. And I'll ask them to draw one line that is the arc of their own learning journey. When were there moments when they felt like they were learning a lot? When were they not learning so much? And then in another color, to lay on a second line that charts how they were feeling over time. What was kind of their emotional journey? And one of the things that I see that help with is that it gives students a real understanding of what are some of the conditions under which they learn the best. And the thing that I often observe that I find completely fascinating is there is often a moment where students report that they were learning a lot, but they weren't very happy. They were stressed, they were anxious, they were nervous, whatever those more negative emotions were. And actually that gap, when you're learning a lot, but it doesn't feel very good, I think is evidence of what in mathematics education is called productive struggle. So when you learn something, or when you're trying to learn something in math and it's hard at first and you don't get it right away, it turns out that learning, it actually lands with you in a deeper way. You're more likely to be able to transfer those skills to other contexts and to continue to use them later. So there's something about actually having to stretch a little bit beyond what you think you can do, which often doesn't feel great. It is anxiety provoking, but actually is where you're learning. And when students can actually see, oh, that was a moment when I was learning a lot, you remember that feeling, right? You remember that feeling of ooh, am I getting this? I got to work a little harder. How am I collaborating? Do I really understand how to navigate? All of those are actually, instead of being something that might shut you down in the future, that might be evidence that oh, you're working right at the edge of your capabilities and you're pushing forward. And I think that is a very powerful idea for all of us, regardless of whether we're students or maybe even more importantly, as we continue on in our careers, is one, to understand how we learn, because every single one of us needs to keep learning. And to understand that when we're struggling, actually, that's a sign that you are working on something that is, demanding of your full faculties and abilities, and to keep with it, and that will actually set you up well to then solve the next harder and harder challenge.
So from your research, your experience, are there any examples of the application and use of these tools and techniques within the government management context? And how can government agencies use these tools and techniques to better serve and deliver mission critical services?
That is an area where I'm seeing a lot of new activity within in terms of bringing design more into the context of government. we did a project actually last year as the pandemic was really unfolding at the same time as the country was gearing up for the national elections, just in terms of how can we equip people who are running local polling places with the tools that they're going to need, because they are each going to be designing or redesigning the process of voting with all of these new health and safety considerations. And that is, just one example. There are many cities and states now around the country that are starting innovation offices where they're sometimes blending design and things like behavioral science. I think there's quite a recognition that there's an opportunity to use design for some of these kinds of complicated systems level challenges, and particularly where, the experience that citizens or members of the public are having when they're interacting with these services can be improved. And I'll just encourage, anyone who's listening to go dig deeper into the story that I was describing before in the state of Michigan. That group has started a social impact design firm called Sevilla. And the work that they are doing across the state, and I believe in one other state as well, around the redesign of the public benefits system is incredibly inspiring and is just a brilliant example of, these are complex systems. It requires a long-term effort and a lot of commitment and a lot of, bringing together stakeholders in a true collaboration to make the kind of change that they're starting to see.
This has been the Business of Government Hour, a conversation with authors, a special series focusing on leading through uncertain times, with Sarah Stein Greenberg, author of Creative Acts for Curious People, How to Think, Create, and Lead in Unconventional Ways. Be sure to join us next time for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government leadership and its effectiveness. Until then, subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Podcast One, iTunes, or on your favorite podcast app. And as always at businessofgovernment.org.